Alrighty, so as Jenny mentioned, my name is Dakota Boyles, and this is a project that I had worked on throughout just this last past semester, and it really aims to focus on setting a larger national history in order so we can understand the smaller local rural histories that are often not quote unquote forgotten, but not told very often. So before I continue, I just want to say thank you to the Carnahan Creek Garrison Cemetery Board and all the Carnahan Creek community members who have supported and helped me and who are in the crowd today. And I want to say thank you to the Chapman Center for allowing me to continue to work on this, and also thank you to the Riley County Genealogical Society. So to start us off, I have these two pictures here, and I just want you to look at them for a second and just kind of think about what you see in them. So on that far picture, it's obviously some women dressed in like their Sunday best with President Eisenhower. And on the other side, it's more women dressed in their Sunday best in front of some buses. Well, let me kind of explain the story behind these pictures. So it is the Belles of the Blue Valley who had attempted to try and lobby the presidents in order to stop the construction of Tuttle Creek that would once take away their land and kick them off of the land that their ancestors had been on. So to begin it all, they had originally got in their cars and gone up to Kansas City to try and lobby President Truman, where he was staying in a hotel in Kansas City. However, not very familiar with the lobbying policies, rules, or anything that went to talking to a president or someone of an important figure like that. They didn't set a meeting, and they just stood in the lobby of Truman's hotel until he had agreed to a 5-minute meeting with them, which with that they didn't really very interested. He didn't seem very interested. And so even though that attempt was not very successful, people started to hear about it, and it had encouraged them to continue to try and fight this big damn foolishness. And so they then turned their attention towards President Eisenhower. And they sent him numerous telegrams, letters, messages, a bunch of things trying to get his attention in order to meet with him to help sway his decision against the dam. And finally, after all those messages had gone unanswered, they sent one final message. Women of Kansas Watersheds Association, spearheaded by Blue Valley, will be in Denver Friday, August 22nd, to present our views on rational water policy as it affects our agricultural Midwest. If we receive no answer by August 16th, we shall consider appointment confirmed. And Eisenhower did respond to that. So they had chartered buses, and 60 Blue Valley residents, Belles of the Blue Valley, got on these buses and went to Denver to meet with him in order to help change the fate that the valley would once see. So I mention these women because it is an example of the pure grit, resilience, personality that even carries with these descendants of the early pioneers that had once settled this valley. So kind of just to set the story, it isn't a story about a dam. It's the story about people, families, farms, churches, and entire towns that were once alive and now underwater. I will use Carnahan Creek as an example of just one of the many early rural settlements and communities that paved the way for these urbanized cities, and just true resistance that came out of these people that had basically given up everything they had ever known to go out and try and make a better life for themselves. These communities weren't just places on a map. They were homes, generational land, and they were raised in the name of flood control. I also have a question I want you guys to kind of think about. Progress marches forward, but at what cost? How do we gather the memories left in its wake and honor those who paid the price of subsequent urbanization? So as I continue, just kind of try and think about that if you would. So I also want to mention, before it was the land that these pioneers once settled on, it was also home to the Kaw Nation, now Kanza, now Kaw Nation. And yeah, if you want to learn more, you can visit the Chapman Center's Land Treaties website. Not to do a little plug for them, but they're a great place. And so, yeah, 20 minutes north of here is where Carnahan Creek kind of state is like settled, and nestled amongst the Flint Hills. And what really drew the early settlers to this land was the fertile bottomland from the continuous flooding of the Big Blue River. So, yeah. So, kind of exploring like the early foundations of Carnahan Creek and just like this true like pioneer spirit that we see even through the generations that are even like still today. Up at the top, I have a picture of the now modern day Google Maps and how long it would take to get from where Samuel and Susanna Carnahan had started their journey in West Deer Township, Pennsylvania, to Carnahan Creek State Park, where it is today. And in this, it's the driving, and it would be 15 hours and 8 minutes in a car today. But back then, they were reliant on wagons, horses, ferries, very limited and very hard transportation. So most of the times, they could only go about 12 to 15 miles a day. So it wasn't very easy to go and leave everything they had at once and ever known to come out west and start a whole new life. In 1855, Samuel and Susanna Carnahan set out with two of their children, Joseph and Martha, out west to hopefully find where they would once be able to call their home. And that wasn't, sorry, that wasn't their entire family. And so the next year, after the original clan had set up their home in Carnahan Creek, Samuel went back to get his other three children from his brother and sister that had stayed with them while they had gone out and tried to establish their new home. This was a challenging way of life, and the Carnahans were no exception. With another example of the true Blue Valley grit and spirit even before Carnahan Creek was established as a community. I kind of talked a little about the Carnahan Creek community, but it wasn't the only one. One I do feel that is important to mention is Juniata and Samuel Dyer. If it wasn't for Juniata and Samuel Dyer, Manhattan really wouldn't be where it is or what it is today. Samuel Dyer had captained the first ferry that was really the only mode of crossing the Big Blue River at the time. And so the early settlers like Isaac Goodnow and everyone who helped create Manhattan into what it is today used his ferry. And so we have these rural communities to thank for what we are living in today. So ironically, Manhattan, whose early settlement relied on these communities, would eventually surpass the rural economic needs of the region. After a year of the start of the Civil War, Pollard and Joseph went up to Marysville to enlist in the Union Army. I also want to mention again, driving today, Marysville is about an hour and 5 minutes away by driving. And once again, they were reliant on walking, wagons, horses, ferries, pretty much anything that wasn't modern transportation, I guess. So it was still quite hard, and they can only go so many miles a day. I also mentioned them going up to guide the supply caravans down into Arkansas as another example of what these early settlers had in like their spirit and their grit and their tenacity for showing the communities that became the stepping stones, helping communities like Manhattan. Like I mentioned, Isaac Goodnow and the early settlers of Manhattan used Samuel Dyer's Ferry and this rural community of Juniata to help get to where they currently would settle, where we currently are, Manhattan. As these early settlers, Isaac Goodnow and the people that came and settled Manhattan, Manhattan began to grow, and then these small farming towns became expendable, and the infrastructure of these towns also became expanded in the name of urban production. At this point, I also would like to mention, even though these towns were expanding and urban needs were becoming very important rather than the rural needs, flooding was also still a very big problem, and it pushed officials to act. But the solution that these officials had prioritized was protecting these urban centers, not these rural, small communities that were the stepping stones for towns like this. I do want to say I just really like this photo. I like this little thing. So, as Manifest Destiny continued to propel the nation westward and urbanization gained momentum, the rural landscape faced increasing pressure. The Blue River Valley became a thriving agricultural community, but it would soon see a very treacherous fate. In 1938, the Flood Control Act was ratified and signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and it officially authorized the construction of Tuttle Creek Reservoir with 6 others in the Missouri River Basin and hundreds of others nationally to help curb the flooding problem that they had deemed so necessary. So, though the initial authorization occurred in 1938, the funding appropriations did not come until 1944. And so in 1944, there was an exploratory drill hole that took place by the Army Corps of Engineers, the ones that would build the dam. And it had solidified what they had thought but never told the residents. Whenever the dam was authorized, the residents were told that they wouldn't be kicked off their lands, they wouldn't be displaced from their generational lands, they wouldn't lose what has been so near and dear to them. But that 1944 drilling confirmed the opposite, and it confirmed the opposite, and the residents would soon be pushed off their land, even though they were originally not. And probably the name that drew you guys all to this, Big Damn Foolishness. Even though after these residents found out that they were going to be pushed off their lands, they were not very happy, and they started a grassroots movement, Big Damn Foolishness. It was spearheaded by a longtime resident, Glenn Stockwell, seen in the bottom photo. And they really kind of just did what also the Bells of the Blue Valley did. They were like hand in hand with each other. They went to Washington to try and lobby the president. They tried to do everything they could to sway these policymakers' decisions so they would not lose the land or their homes or lives that they had grown to love and create. I also want to talk about Doris and Leona Vellon, who were longtime residents of Claiborne. And they organized trips to places like Denver, Washington, D.C., to once again gain a chance at lobbying President Eisenhower to hopefully stop the construction of Tuttle Creek Dam. And for all these like lobbying attempts and just trying to fight for their homes, it all seemed to come to an end July 13th, 1951. What locals seemed to deem their Black Friday. So, like mentioned before, flooding was a really big problem, and July 13th came a really big, horrific flood that had affected cities across Kansas, including Kansas City, Topeka, and Manhattan. So it wasn't only Manhattan that was being affected by these problems. It ultimately resulted in damage that amounted to over $20 million throughout the state. And it left Manhattan submerged under 6 feet of water, covering an area of 220 blocks. This flood had swayed longtime opponent of the dam, Albert Cole, who was the representative of the Blue River Valley, to switch his decision into now supporting the dam and the need for flood control. Once again, this obviously angered the citizens, the residents of the Blue Valley, so that switch in position ultimately lost him the election in 1952, where in 1952, Representative Howard Miller was thus elected by the Blue River Valley residents, and they deemed him a better fit because he had also been a longtime person that had participated in the farming in the Blue River Valley, and he understood what was to be lost if this dam was destroyed. That photo all the way on that side, that is downtown Manhattan. You can still see where the water was. In 1952, Major General Lewis A. Pick, Chief Engineer of the Army Corps of Engineers, officially approved the project report for Tuttle Creek Dam. This also included what they had found out in that 1944 exploratory drilling that I had mentioned earlier, and basically once again sealed the fate that the Blue River Valley would not be what it currently is after this dam was created. So construction started on October 7th, 1952, and just over a year later, in December of 1953, the project came to a halt due to a lack of federal funding and support. Again, the work resumed in 1955 once Congress appropriated more money ultimately in the end, the Corps negotiated with 1,713 different landowners over a period of 13 years to acquire project lands. As a result, the Corps acquired a title to over a total of 33,847 acres in fee simple ownership, while also purchasing flowage easements on an additional 27,376 acres. By July 1st, 1962, the completed dam was operational under the guise of flood control. 61,223 acres were permanently lost to a state-sponsored man-made permanent flood. In 1993, we saw yet the same fate that we did in 1951, except this time the dam was already complete and operational. Because of such downpour and rain that had occurred that was putting pressure on the dam, the Corps of Engineers decided to just open the floodgates and deliberately flood parts of Manhattan. And in 2018, it nearly overtopped again, nearly flooding Manhattan once again. And because of this, the Corps started diverting millions to repair the dam, not only just the structural damage, but also reinforce the dam. I'm not a geology person or geography, but it is relatively close, if I did my research right, to the only fault line that runs through Kansas. So I don't want to know if that fault line ever goes off, what would happen. Jumping to 2025, I do also want to mention the recent flooding that happened in Wichita not that long ago. But also, if you live here in Manhattan, the flooding that happened like just the other week, um, it is a powerful reminder that the fight over flood control is far from over, despite being in an urbanized center that these policymakers had fought so hard to protect. Um, Dams may shift water, but they don't eliminate the risk of the flooding. So, even though there was a prevented damage of over $8 billion from floods, we cannot forget about what was lost in the name of urban economic interests that overshadowed these rural communities. 61,223 acres were permanently sacrificed in the name of flood control. But before the valley was flooded, 3 cemeteries were exhumed and then reinterred at Carnahan Creek Garrison Cemetery. 3,000 Blue Valley residents were pushed out of their homes. Oldsburg, Kansas, a product of the Blue Valley residents who did not want to abandon the land after Tuttle Creek was completed, stands as a testament to the enduring rural bonds that these communities had maintained, not only with the valley, but also with their community that their ancestors had founded years ago. So, the Blue Valley, once rich with harvests and history, was more than land, it was life. Today it rests beneath the reservoir, its story muffled by water that replaced it. The next time you visit Tuttle Creek State Park, take a moment to reflect on the land beneath your feet, once home to thriving communities, rich farmland, and generations of history now hidden beneath the surface. So, I take you back to that question I posed to you at the beginning. Progress marches forward, but at what cost? How do we gather the memories left in its wake and honor those who paid the price of subsequent urbanization? Well, we write the names of that history left behind. We preserve the cemeteries, the family stories, the ferry crossings, and the schoolhouses, not just as nostalgia, but as evidence of what was lost. We honor the people who were displaced by making sure they are no longer erased. We teach their history and research their struggles, and we stand where they stood, knowing we benefit from what they built. And most importantly, we ask better questions before we call something progress, because memory, like water, will always find a way through, and that's how we gather the memories. That's how we honor the cost of the who paid the price. And so, I leave you with some slides of why this story exactly matters. As I was finishing up this presentation and some research, I asked some of the Carnahan Creek Garrison community members what this story meant to them and why it matters so much to help preserve it. And one quote that I got really stood out to me, and I want to leave you with. Carnahan Creek is more than just a place. In my mind, it's not a lost community, as long as we hold the faith, strength, and resilience of our pioneer ancestors in our hearts and continue to share their stories. The historic church and cemetery are where our past and present meet, and we are the gatekeepers. Geraldine Johnson Elton, descendant of Reverend Walter and Lydia Jane Curry, who settled in Carnahan Creek in 1872. Once again, I just want to say thank you to the Carnahan Creek Garrison Cemetery Board for inviting me to become a keeper of your history. Thank you to the Riley County Genealogical Society for inviting me to share. Thank you to the Chapman Center again. And also thank you to my friends, family, and Dr. Heather McCrae, who supported me in this research and also listened to my constant ramblings. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to continuing to work on the Carnahan Creek project in a more focused, narrower history. Questions?